But yes, I'm really pleased tonight to introduce today's speaker. He's one of the Royal Air Force Museum's own, Gary Haines, the Museum's Archivist. And today he's going to talk about the cost and controversy of Rhubarb Sorties. So I'm going to introduce Gary to give his talk. Come on, Gary, up here, come.
Thanks, Harry. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and for coming along today. And hello to everybody watching online as well. In this talk, I'll be looking at Rhubarb operations and their legacy, which is rooted in the move into the offensive by Fighter Command. I will also investigate some of the personal stories that relate to them. This paper will highlight the forgotten Rhubarb operations from 1940 to 1944. I began as archivist for the RAF Museum in September 2019. And in the first week, Nina Hadaway, the Archive Library and Research Manager, gave me a tour of the store. And of course, I was curious to see what was in those lovely acid-free boxes. One of the items that Nina showed me would go on to spark a blog and lots of ongoing research. And it's this item here. The archive item was Douglas Bader's logbook. Within the pages of this book was an entry that caught my eye. When we went through the book, there was written in pencil by Bader, underlined for emphasis, and reflecting RAF slang of the time, reading simply, McKnight killed, strafing Huns. It was dated the 12th of January 1941. Here we have an image of McKnight on the right-hand side looking up at a cartoon that was on most of the aircraft of number 242 Squadron. Research led me to discover that by the 12th of January 1941, Flying Officer McKnight, part of Bader's number 242 Squadron, had achieved a total of 17 confirmed victories. 2 shared destroyed and 3 unconfirmed destroyed, marking him firmly as an ace. The full results of this research can be found on my blog post for the RAF Museum entitled Posts from the Archive, Bader's Logbook. One aspect of this research intrigued me. McKnight, I discovered, was killed while undertaking a Rhubarb operation. In fact, subsequent research would show that he was the first casualty on the Rhubarb. The first question I had to therefore ask myself was, what was a Rhubarb? Being of a certain age, the first thing that came to mind was a rather colourful animated dog and a catchy theme tune. Rhubarbs were in fact defined as being Royal Air Force patrols over territory occupied by the enemy, to be made by single fighters or formations up to a flight in strength, usually about 6 aircraft. These were operating under cloud cover. The patrols were not to be made, however, when the clouds come down below 2,000 feet. This was later changed to 1,500 feet. The primary purpose, which is important to note for this talk, was to attack enemy aircraft in flight. But if no enemy aircraft were seen in flight, pilots might, in favourable circumstances, attack suitable ground objectives. These are defined as being German military objectives. Rhubarbs were originally called mosquitoes as they were supposed to mirror the insects by buzzing around and being generally annoying, but the name was soon changed due to confusion with the aircraft of that name. Rhubarbs were designed from their outset as aggressive offensive operations to ensure that the Luftwaffe could not fly over their own territory without being concerned over interceptions, and also troop movements could be hindered. They were designed to show that operations in occupied Europe would be met with opposition. It's to be remembered that after Dunkirk, the only way the offensive could be taken to Germany was via the Royal Air Force. The Battle of Britain, of which we marked the 80th year anniversary of last year, was a defensive operation, as was of course the RAF operations over Dunkirk. The concept of Rhubarbs was to place the RAF at the heart of the offensive against Germany and the territories it occupied. Namely of concern, of course, to the RAF, the occupied territories of France, Belgium and Holland. It's therefore surprising to find that there's little written on Rhubarbs. Just a small search on RAF Battle of Britain on a well-known book-selling website reveals some 904 results. RAF Rhubarbs produces 6. 2 of these are relating to the memories of Air Vice Marshal Johnny Johnson, and one is a romance novel called Rhubarbs and Circuses. Perhaps even more relevant, on a search via the London Library looking at academic books, articles and reviews, Royal Air Force and Battle of Britain revealed some 297 results, and Royal Air Force and Rhubarb produces 1 possible result. it would have to take you going there to having a look to see whether it's actually relevant. There has to date been no academic or popular history book or article focusing purely on rhubarb operations. There are of course many books written on the history of fighter command. However, they tend to neglect rhubarbs or give them just a few sentences. Rhubarbs are often mixed in with the other operations at the time. And here we have a summary of some of them. These are rovers, armed reconnaissance over enemy territory, rodeos, fighter sweeps over enemy territory, ramrods, operations against enemy ground targets, circuses, fighter escorts for bombers over enemy territory, and intruders, offensive patrols over enemy territory. As you shall see, there was even confusion sometimes amongst RAF command over what the operation was, and the terms were used interchangeably at times. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I will be concentrating on rhubarb operations that are officially classified as such. Rhubarb operations were the first offensive operations undertaken by the RAF in the Second World War. However, unlike the Battle of Britain, it can be argued that the results of these were not what was expected, even though they were in operation from 1940 to 44 and were highly influential in aiding RAF pilots in gaining experience in flying in hostile enemy territory and undertaking ground attacks, both of which would come in rather useful later on in the Second World War. One reason why rhubarbs have been neglected can be found in Air 16/528 at the National Archive, one of the Air Ministry files that looks at the operations. A note dated 6th of October 1943 states that on 630 rhubarb sorties, the RAF had suffered 9% Category E, which is aircraft written off unrepairable, and 5% Category B, repairable and maintenance unit casualties. 4 enemy aircraft were destroyed in these sorties and ground targets attacked successfully. 6 aircraft were, however, reported as lost the day before this report was written, and I quote, "This was possibly due to pilots proceeding on rhubarbs with inadequate cloud cover." In summation, and important for the purposes for this talk, it states, "It does appear, however, that our rhubarb operations are somewhat unprofitable." Group Captain Stevens, who composed this note, follows it up a day later with more observations after being in contact with Number 11 Group, that 5 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air and 2 on the ground for the loss of 4 RAF aircraft. The 2 other aircraft lost were lost to flak on a roadstead, which is then crossed out and amended to ramrod. This note gives you some insight into why rhubarbs are not as well featured in research as other operations. Firstly, they are seen, as to quote the group captain, as unprofitable, as they are very much involved in many ways of waging a war of attrition against the enemy, and this is something many like to think finished in the First World War. And secondly, they can get lost in the various operations that were taking place. Even here, there's evidence of confusion between a ramrod, attacks against enemy ground targets with bombers, and a roadstead, attacks against enemy shipping. In Number 66 Squadron's operations book for December 1940, one patrol is noted in the Marjolania as the first rhubarb. This is described officially as taking off under operations orders on the 20th of December 1940, a day before the instructions on rhubarbs were officially issued. 2 Spitfires of Number 66 Squadron piloted by Flight Lieutenant Christie and the pilot officer Bodie took off from Biggin Hill and flew across the channel. The weather is described as continuous rain and drizzle, middle period of day with fog. Visibility is described as poor to very poor. This was ironically ideal flying conditions for rhubarbs. The logic being that few Luftwaffe fighters would be flying in this weather, allowing the Royal Air Force more freedom over the skies of occupied territory. Those that were flying were presumed to be easy targets, as probably flying as a pair maximum. Of course, what this meant in reality was that the Royal Air Force pilots would be going up and flying in conditions that was far from ideal for them as well. It was reported that on the first rhubarb, Christie and Bodie flew across the Dieppe, turned inland, were fired at and returned fire. On their way back, Bodie also opened fire on some buildings. These were buildings on the French seafront. This raised official concerns over what was legitimate targets for rhubarbs, and I believe led to rhubarbs being defined by historians as, and I quote, either freelance intrusions or freelance flights to hit targets of opportunity. so given the Rhubarbs and the pilots who flew them a sort of gung-ho reputation, which, as we shall see, was far from the truth. On the 22nd of August 1939, Fighter Command received a paper entitled Air Ministry Instructions and Notes on the Rules to be Observed by the Royal Air Force in War. This was circulated widely. As stated in the Air Historical Branch narrative on this period, shortly after the outbreak of war, it was considered desirable to inform those concerned that a clause in the instructions which authorised attacks on air units, military aerodromes, depots, storage units, bomb stores and other establishments must be freely interpreted in regards to attacks on objectives in the vicinity of the land battle. On the 4th of June 1940, new instructions were issued which Fighter Command received on the 5th of June, and the categories which could be attacked were enlarged. Reflecting the ever-changing dynamic battlefield at the time, in July 1940, it was decided that any military objectives in France and other countries under enemy occupation could be bombarded. However, this was strictly to be based on intelligence that the military establishments were known to be occupied by enemy forces, and moving trains categorically could not be attacked, presumably due to the high risk of civilian casualties. Of course, this was not much help in regards to guidance when flying on could be attacked, but not if attacking them involved the intentional bombardment of civilian populations or undue risk to civilians. Again, they must be known to be working for the Germans or Italians. Lines of communication and transportation and means of intercommunication serving military purposes could be attacked, but attacks on moving trains and on merchant ships were still forbidden. Trains did not become regarded as a legitimate target until October 1941. Although these instructions dealt with identifying ground targets, the official view was still that Rhubarb should be against enemy aircraft in flight. Attacks on ground targets were secondary. This was certainly the view of Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas. And in a dispatch written to the Secretary of State for Air on the 1st of February 1948, Douglas states that he had considered it important that the primary objective of the operation, namely the destruction of enemy aircraft, should not be forgotten, and discourage any tendency to give undue emphasis to the attacks on ground targets. This seems to be at odds with the situation in which the pilots found themselves, flying over the channel, flying over occupied territory, and flying back again without being able to target any enemy installations if no aircraft was seen. The reality, however, seems to have been somewhat different. In Air 16/528, a review of gun cine film by intelligence officers dated July 1942 reveals the following when investigating Rhubarb operations. Number one, a great deal of ammunition is wasted. Much was expended firing into the open sea. This probably seems to indicate frustration on parts of the pilots firing into the sea when returning, or not as they weren't able to target anything. Number two, an attack on a water tower used all the ammunition that could have been used on barges when they were located. This indicates they were targeting the first thing they see. And number three, the Air Ministry is very concerned about the number of indiscriminate attacks that have been made. Pilots were on record as being disciplined for attacking, in the Air Ministry's view, indiscriminately. There is also concern, which runs throughout the file, that the nature of the attacks by pilots undertaking Rhubarbs could be used by German propaganda. One indiscriminate attack on a train is reported as indeed being used in the propaganda. This seems to gain more credence when the Air Ministry file reveals that some of the targets were attacked include a random French village, an apparent random factory, and a farmer on a horse-drawn farm cart. French officials, unsurprisingly, contacted the Air Ministry to complain about this. However, with all this happening, it's still stated on the 17th of October 1942 that with all the ground targets that we suggest for Rhubarb objectives, there is a danger that primary purpose of Rhubarbs, namely the destruction of aircraft in the air, may be lost sight of. It is strongly suggested, not surprisingly, that intelligence supplies information as to suitable objectives for Rhubarb attacks, for distribution down to stations. Rhubarb seem to be caught tactically between their original prime goal of finding aircraft in the air and destroying them, which was a rare occurrence, and inflicting damage on the enemy when over occupied territory. The frustrations of pilots can be understood better when you realise that the pilots in the aircraft were at their very limits of operation, as you can see from this map taken from the files in the RAF Museum Archive. Rhubarb Operations Appendix 8, Hutted Camps. The limit was ID'd at the time as 150 miles from the nearest fighter command bases to the enemy coast. As a fighter pilot, you had flown across the channel into enemy-held skies, endured anti-aircraft fire, the fear of the Luftwaffe pouncing on you, and you're searching for your target. You wished to be on the offensive. The result of the first Rhubarb, where some random beach huts were shot up, seems to confirm this. Douglas himself also seems to express this wish in part 2 of his biography titled Years of Command. In this, he says, "Since the whole of our thinking in the Royal Air Force has always been that offensive was the best form of defence, the work of fighter command in the defence of this country against the Battle of Britain was not confined merely to the waging of the night battle against the German bombers and waiting for an invasion. After the Battle of Britain, we had immediately started making plans for a change in the use that was to be made of the day fighters. And by the time that I arrived at Fighter Command, they are already about to go onto the offensive and to be given a chance to hit back at the Germans over their own territory in occupied France." He goes on to link this thinking with Viscount Hugh Trenchard, the father of the Royal Air Force, as it was reported to Douglas that Trenchard had suggested that Fighter Command should go on the offensive to, in Trenchard's own words, lean towards France. By this time, Trenchard was unofficially visiting RAF units. And here we have an image of him in France in 1940. Trenchard was certainly an advocate of aggressive tactics and believed in taking the fight to the enemy, as he had done when in command of the Royal Flying Corps in France in the First World War, causing controversy over losses, controversies that would echo down the years later and attach themselves to Douglas. Now, many view Rhubarb operations, to quote an entry in an operations record book, as a ruddy waste of time. Douglas's dispatch gives some clues as to why these operations could be seen as a waste of aircraft and, more importantly, experienced pilots, many veterans of the Battle of Britain. He states that between the 20th of December 1940 and 13th of June 1941, 149 Rhubarb patrols involving 336 sorties were flown, of which 45 were rendered abortive by unsuitable weather or other circumstances. German aircraft were seen in the air on 26 occasions, to a total of 77 aircraft, and on 18 occasions they were engaged. The destruction of 7 enemy aircraft was claimed for the loss of 8 of our pilots, and 116 separate attacks were made on a variety of surface objectives, including ships, road vehicles, airfield buildings, grounded aircraft, artillery and searchlight posts, German troops and military camps. This, putting it crudely, seems to say 8-7 to the RAF. Not a good score when one considers the experience of the men as well. Of course, as can be seen here, ground targets become the prime motivation for the Rhubarb operations. Much of the planning of these being undertaken by squadron intelligence officers and the pilots themselves. This planning was also contradictory to perceived opinions about Rhubarbs. It was very meticulous. As previously alluded to, there are extant planning files relating to Rhubarb operations held in the RAF Museum Archive. And here we see one example. Oops. Here we go. These go into great detail as to the location of the camps and also photographic surveillance so that they can be recognised from the air. Here we have one image. Other files carry even greater detail as well. And this drawing is taken from the file Rhubarb Operations Appendix 10, Coastal RDF Stations. This file even contains diagrams of the various radar operators known to be in operation. And here we have Freya. And it also involves mapping, and quite detailed mapping as well. And here we have another map showing the radar stations that they believe are operational. This file, however, unlike some of the other files in the archive, does state that these targets are currently not yet open to attack. What clearly comes across when looking into these files is a determination to ensure that the maximum damage is done while undertaking a rhubarb against these targets. This is obviously intelligence-led, so much so that the file on hutted camps goes into details of when the camps will be occupied at their maximum, around breakfast and dinner time. There seems to be some doubt whether the German forces actually stopped for a lunch break. Now, RAF pilots undertaking rhubarbs faced the same issues as their Luftwaffe counterparts had in 1940. The aircraft would be at the limit of its range, and if shot down in the air and survived, it's likely they would become a POW. By researching the excellent source of Norman Frank's Fighter Command losses volumes, which we have in the RAF Museum Library, a story emerges of the cost in terms of men on these rhubarb operations. Undertaking a complete survey of these 3 volumes, I was able to identify 285 incidents which resulted in damage to aircraft or loss of aircraft and pilot or undertaking rhubarbs. The majority of those involved losses of pilots, with some 154 killed. Also, contrary to assumed knowledge, rhubarb operations continued to be flown for most of the war, until at least the 6th of August 1944, when the last rhubarb loss was recorded. This was a Flight Lieutenant Gurr who had his engine fail in his Typhoon after being hit by flak after attacking motorised transport, and he was forced to land behind American lines. Although perhaps the term by then was being applied slightly more loosely. It's also to be highlighted that rhubarb operations were also flown in all theatres of war. Here we have a page from the logbook of Pilot Officer Frederick William Cox, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, number 79 Squadron, which we have in the archive. You will note among the operations he was taking part in the East were rhubarbs. And here we have an image of Cox himself. Cox was awarded the DFC, and in his citation it was described him as a displaying brilliant leadership, a fine fighting spirit and most skillful airmanship. While undertaking long-range escort missions and close support low-level attacks, the majority of these were over the mountains and jungles of Burma. He's far from a gung-ho pilot. Now, some 50 pilots were captured while undertaking rhubarbs and become POWs, although 12 did evade. Among those who become POWs was Pilot Officer Scheidheier, who was shot down in November 1942 by flak, imprisoned and escaped Stalag Luft 3 on the 24th of March 1944, but was recaptured and, along with 49 others, executed. Among the 154 killed on rhubarbs were 2 wing commanders and 11 squadron leaders. 13 pilots who held the DFC were killed, and 3 of those become POWs. Examining some of these men in more detail gives a snapshot into the cost of rhubarbs. I hope in the future to complete a full list of all rhubarb operations, which doesn't exist at the moment. One of the first things that strikes you when investigating individual operations is the loss felt and occasionally the bitterness expressed that an experienced pilot had been killed on a rhubarb. This is clear when looking at the loss of Flight Sergeant Eric Locke, DFC DSO, of number 611 Squadron, who was killed on the 3rd of August 1941. The operations record book recalls the following. Slightly cloudy morning turning to lovely sunny afternoon. 6 pairs of the squadron indulged in rhubarbs, 1 in the morning and 5 pairs in the afternoon, but there was insufficient cloud over France, so everyone come back except Lockie, who went in with Flight Lieutenant Cathall's of 403 Squadron. The OOB goes on to record that Locke was last seen streaking down a road at the back of Boulogne, brassing off soldiers on bicycles and whooping over the radio transmitter, "Ha ha, look at the bastards running." It seems a ruddy awful waste to lose so great a pilot and so trivial an expedition. And these words form the title of a book on Flight Sergeant Locke. The use of the words indulged and trivial give a clue as to how the person writing up the ORB felt about rhubarb operations. Although it's to be pointed out, of the 6 pilots who took part in rhubarbs on this day, there was just 1 loss. The squadron would take part in 3 rhubarb operations in August, involving 11 pilots, most of their duties being flying bomber escort, fighter sweeps and convoy patrols. In this month, they recorded 3 additional losses of men on these duties. Rhubarb operations were comparatively rare compared to other duties purely because they depended on set weather conditions. The ORB for 611 Squadron also offers a glimpse into how squadrons had to move on quickly from such an event. The following day it's reported, Air Vice Marshal Lee Mallory paid us a visit and stayed to dinner. A good time was had by all. The station orchestra putting on a very good show, and the Canadians of 403 Squadron, who replaced 54 Squadron, were also amusing. The description in the ORB of Locke's whooping is of course a reminder that these pilots were young men full of adrenaline and bravado. When Flight Sergeant Locke was killed, he was 22 years old. However, this is not to underestimate the experience lost by his death on a Rhubarb. Locke was one of the most successful Battle of Britain pilots, and by the time of his death had 21 victories, 16 of those in the Battle of Britain. One can therefore imagine his frustration flying Rhubarbs and having difficulty finding targets, or his thoughts on being told what not to attack. This may explain his actions. Also, as a veteran of the Battle of Britain, he probably would have seen many of his friends killed in action as well. Wing Commander Brendan Eamon Funigan of 155 Squadron was another highly experienced decorated pilot with a DSO and a DFC. On the 15th of July 1942, the Wing Commander briefed 30 pilots regarding an attack on a hutted camp in northern France that was to be targeted. During the subsequent Rhubarb operation, his aircraft was hit by ground fire and ditched into the English Channel, and he sunk with his aircraft. Funigan, nicknamed Paddy due to his Irish roots, had a wealth of experience and skill. He had been posted to No. 65 Squadron based at Hornchurch just before the start of the Battle of Britain, and he played a leading role in the defence of the country. In May 41, his DFC citation read, "This officer has shown great keenness in his efforts to engage the enemy, and he has destroyed at least 5 of their aircraft. His courage and enthusiasm have been a source of encouragement to other pilots of the squadron." By September 1941, he had been awarded 2 more DFCs, and in October 41, a DSO, the citation of which read, "Recently, during 2 sorties of consecutive days, he destroyed 5 Messerschmitt 109s, bringing his total victories to at least 20. The squadron has destroyed 42 enemy aircraft, of which he has personally destroyed 15. The successes achieved are undoubtedly due to this officer's brilliant leadership and example." Funigan's aircraft was painted with a shamrock emblem near its cockpit. A member of his ground crew decided to add to this and painted a circle of swastikas on the aircraft to show his confirmed victories. In an act which says much about the character of the man, he asked for them to be removed as he felt it was wrong to boast about his actions that must result in the death of many young men. Funigan himself was only 21 when he was killed. He was so respected and a national hero in Britain that on his death a mass in Westminster Cathedral was said for him and 3,000 people attended. A subsequent appeal raised money in his name for Funigan Ward in Richmond Royal Hospital. Another story came to light when researching, and this was for a flying officer, O.B. James. The ORB of 245 Squadron writes of the events of the 4th of October 1943. "The day's operations were marred by the failure of the squadron's popular one-handed pilot, Flying Officer O.B. James MDFM, and his No. 2, Flight Sergeant J.D. Flynn, to return from a long-range Rhubarb. They were airborne at 16:35 hours and intended attacking enemy aircraft in the area west of Paris. Nothing more was heard of them. At 17:20, our wire service picked up a Hun interception on their course. This claimed 2 destroyed, so it looks like it was our 2 machines. James was such a loss to the squadron that the officer wrote an entry in the ORB detailing his life. Flying Officer James was an ex-sergeant pilot in Bomber Command who carried out numerous sorties in Hamdens over Berlin, Cologne, Bremen, and all the other famous German targets. He was shot down in March 41 while attacking Brest and sustained an injury to his left hand, which could have normally been fixed, but the German doctors had a lot on their hands at the time and apparently decided to amputate. Later, James succeeded in escaping and returned to operational flying in single-seater fighters. He was remarkably keen and a very capable pilot. The diary then recalled successful Rhubarbs had been flown, which included firing of 3 trains, a blockhouse, a signal box, and scattering about 100 Germans in a field, also damaging a locomotive in a siding. Later, 2 trains and trucks were shot up, and on another rhubarb in the afternoon, it was described that a storehouse caught fire and blazed furiously. There is no bitterness towards rhubarbs in this report. These are just some of the 285 stories that I could tell. There was one more fact that stood out when researching rhubarb operation losses, one enemy that could be continuous and lethal to all pilots flying them. Pierre Klosterman, writing in The Big Show, expressed his fear of a weapon that would be the biggest enemy of pilots taking part in rhubarb operations. We were at 14,000 feet and kept straight on over to the left, as if we had no intention of attacking. I took a close look at the field. The small dark crosses parked just where we had expected them showed up on the bright grass of early spring. I particularly noticed 1, 2, 4, 7 flak towers, their shadows clearly projected on the perimeter track by the sun. Look out, film star leader, flak at 6 o'clock. Sure enough, 200 yards behind us, 5 big black puffs from 88mm shells had appeared. Okay, 5 more seconds, then I would attack. The objective was behind us and we were facing the sun. Fear caught me by the throat and stopped me breathing. Aerial combat against fighters had always found me calm after the early stages, but flak was quite different. Klosterman flew over 420 operational sorties, but he was literally gripped by fear regarding flak. Flak shot down 62 aircraft on rhubarb operations, in which the pilot was recorded as killed. The greatest enemy was not enemy fighters, but flak. In the total of 285 recorded operational losses relating to rhubarbs, 130 were attributed to flak. Only 29 were attributed to encounters with enemy aircraft. Now, one of my favourite collections of documents in the RAF Museum Archive are its combat reports, which literally put you in the cockpit with the pilot when you read them. And of course, amongst these are rhubarb operations. In the combat report file for number 3 squadron can be found a combat report dated 28th of August 1943. This report goes into great detail regarding the rhubarb. It reports that Flying Officer Foster and Flight Sergeant Tidy took off from Manston at 12:50 hours in typhoons, not bamfoons, as somebody's really done a bad typo in that, and landed again at 2:04. Within this hour and 14 minutes, they had crossed over at 0 feet into the northern edge of Dunkirk, encountering no flak. They broke cloud at 500 foot into a rainstorm, and Flight Sergeant Tidy attacked a goods train with cannon hits observed at the front of the cab. Flying Officer Foster witnessed an explosion. Later they encountered 2 strings of barges and the pilots attacked 1 string each. Barges in a tug were confirmed sunk. Foster then had exhausted his ammunition and got separated in a rainstorm. He came out of the cloud to spy an FW-190 on a runway about to take off, but could not attack. He then spotted a military convoy of 6 to 8 vehicles. Again, he couldn't attack because he didn't have any ammunition left. He went back into cloud and eventually joined up with Flight Sergeant Tidy as they returned to Manston. All this took part in an hour and 14 minutes. In this report can be seen evidence of the weather conditions rhubarbs were flown in, the harassing nature of them, and also the frustration of seeing other targets and not having any ammunition. They did, however, hit their primary target, which was, as stated on the report, canal traffic, with the locomotive being an added extra. Attacking trains was fraught with danger. It was often debated whether these were a legitimate target. Eric Shipper, number 165 Squadron, recalled a rhubarb he went on with Sergeant John Curry on the 16th of January 1943. This was reported in David Oliver's Fighter Command book. And he says, "We flew 0 feet over the channel crossing the French coast. We eventually spotted a freight train upon which we both made 2 attacks. During these, the sides of one of the trucks opened up to reveal machine guns manned by German soldiers, who returned our fire. This was the first time that RAF aircraft come across armed freight trains, and it was of sufficient interest to gain a mention in the BBC 9 o'clock news bulletin that evening, and a paragraph in the next morning's papers. This flight, the first of its type carried out by a squadron, turned out to be only one of 4 before the CO cancelled any more, following the loss of 3 more pilots, 2 killed and 1 missing during the next 3 sorties." Now, in conclusion, we have seen our rhubarb operations are not as well recognised as other operations from this period, and in many respects a gung-ho aspect hangs around them. It's of course easy to dismiss rhubarbs as a waste of aircraft and highly experienced men for little gain. However, this was an offensive and, I would say, attritional operation, and losses are sadly part of routine when attacking the enemy, literally bringing the fight to them on their doorstep. Of course, it was the experienced veterans who'd be at the forefront of this, as it was their way, their experience was needed. As the Air Historical Branch narrative comments when focusing on the 40 to 41 period, the threat of low-level attack cannot have been without its effect on the morale of Luftwaffe personnel on the ground, and must have modified the enemy's attitude to such questions as the manning of ground defences. This perhaps can explain a high level of operational losses lost to flak as defences were improved, and also possibly can be seen in effect with a train operating with German soldiers as defenders. Command experience was also gained via rhubarb operations. Again, quoting the AHB narrative, there can be no doubt the experience gained by pilots, intelligence officers and the staffs of lower formations, generally in the planning and execution of these patrols, was of great immediate and still greater potential. Although this was not always apparent at the time, it's easy to see now how valuable a training ground this operation was for many who would one day share in supporting the operations of an armed force on the continent. Another operation which benefited from pilots undertaking rhubarbs, and which was indeed termed at one time a rhubarb, were noble operations. There we go. These were to target and destroy the launch sites of the V-1 flying bombs. Here we have an extract from TNA file Air 40/1675, clearly noting that noble targets were rhubarb designated operations. Nobles and the link into rhubarb operations is another area of research I hope to investigate soon. Rhubarbs were the first step in taking the fight to the enemy, spearheaded by the Royal Air Force. The operations and the men involved in them deserve to be more well known and their achievements recognised. Thank you.
Yeah, really enjoyed the talk. I had to miss some of it because we've had some technical problems. So we've had a lovely online audience. Very happily, a lot of them have stayed with us. We've also got an audience in the room, so if you've got a question, can I ask that you say it out, and then Gary, can you repeat it so that the online audience can also hear it? So yes, Chris.
Hi, Gary.
Hi, Chris.
When you were doing your research, what is it that made the biggest surprise to you that you didn't expect to come across?
Yeah, when I was doing my research. Yeah, of course. You asked when I was doing my research what the biggest surprise was to me. I think the biggest surprise was nobody else seems to have done the research. It seemed quite odd because it was an offensive operation. It was very much the first offensive operation after the Battle of Britain and Dunkirk. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, it sort of all gets muddled up with all the other operations that were going on at the time. And it just appears to me, when I first looked at the entry in Bader's logbook, I thought, oh, I was going to find loads of stuff straight away about it, but there was nothing there. So in some ways it's really great because it means there's lots for me to do more research on, but also it's quite frustrating because I've got to dig it all out of the archive, which is a great thing, but also a frustrating thing as well.
Okay, great. We've got a question from online. It's John Usher. He's a regular. So hello, John. This raises the question, I think he's responding to one of your slides where you showed the range of various fighters, and raises the issue of slow development of drop tanks for British fighters, long-range fighters in particular. He mentions the range is minimal, let alone for long-range bombing escort or deployment abroad, for instance, Malta. And he wonders, is there anything in the literature about this?
There is some in the literature about whether the 150 miles they can expand it, and there is something. I've just purely scratched the surface with the TNA file, but there is something in there about looking at how to designate certain rhubarbs as long-range rhubarbs, and they're talking about mosquitoes having long-range tanks on them. So there's certainly stuff there you can do the research on to do it. And I'm sure the pilots at the time were saying, look, we're operating at our limits. Let's not do this. Let's do other things. But as I said, in the one operation I looked at, it was an hour and 40 minutes there and back doing that sort of thing. But if they'd have extended it with more long-range fuel tanks, then of course they could have hit better and possibly better strategic targets.
Yeah, there's a great article in the Society for Military History Journal.
Yeah.
The name of the author has completely escaped me, but I'll post it into the comments afterwards.
Cool.
So yeah, great question. Are there any questions in the room? Yes, sir.
As time went on, were there learnings?
Yeah, you asked whether sort of the RAF pilots learned from the Rhubarb operations and also whether the Germans were being worn down. Well, first of all, with the RAF pilots, what I'm hoping to do, one of the things I want to do when I compile an operations list, is see how many pilots did so many Rhubarbs. You know, we have logbooks, etc. For example, Cox, who I showed you, and one of the things I want to do is go through that and see how many Rhubarb operations he actually did. And I want to compare the intelligence files to see whether their intelligence got better, because the intelligence that they're working at is incredibly detailed. As I mentioned with the huts, it's all about, they give you time, something like 0700 hours to 0800 hours is the optimum time when the Germans apparently have their breakfast, that you can go over to them and shoot down their huts. So there was lots of stuff there. What I'm interested in as well, as you mentioned rightly, is the German side of things, whether they were getting worn down. I've got those two examples, which very much hearsay about, you know, the trains were being armed, and also the fact that they were getting more and more shot up by flak. So what I'm interested in is looking at the other side of things, looking at the Germans, see if there's actually any proof whether they changed their strategy or their tactics because of Rhubarbs. Possibly they did, but it's something that, you know, we're going to have to try and, I think research would be the thing that proves that at some point in the future. And I think a big source for Rhubarbs is pilots' memoirs. That'll be something to go back through and have a look and see whether they improved on them and where the evidence is, whether they did or not. You know, how many Rhubarbs did you do? If you come across the fact that pilots only did 3 or 4 and thought, yeah, that's enough, I'm not doing any more, that says it all, really. But, you know, you just got to do the research and find out. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to follow on with that. Robert Baker asks, I thought that Johnny Johnson thought that they were a bad idea. I believe he does think that.
He does think, yeah, there's quite a few pilots that are don't have pleasant things to say about Rhubarbs. And Johnny Johnson is one of them. So, and I'm assuming that's why his name comes up when you search for Rhubarbs when you look at books, because it's one of the more famous things he goes on about. But on the other hand, you get other pilots that just seem to do them and don't, you know, you've got some ORBs where it's obvious that the person writing up the ORBs thinks Rhubarbs is a ridiculous, stupid waste of time and money and men and equipment. And you've got others where I think, yeah, this is okay, we managed to destroy these targets. So, you know, there's an interesting mix of things going on there. And of course, Sholto Douglas, there's this whole link with him and unneeded waste, because obviously because of his links with Trenchard as well.
Do you think that there's a reason different squadrons had different perceptions of Rhubarbs? I mean, does it seem that some had more success and then saw them favourably,
Yeah.
others incurred prominent casualties and so didn't like them?
Yeah, I think so. And also, in an ironic way also, I think it also depended on who got killed. If it was like very experienced pilots who was getting killed, like Locke, for instance, there would be this thing where, oh, you know, he got killed on a Rhubarb, what did we do? Oh, we shot up a train. Oh, brilliant. That's great. Whereas, and they were obviously the aces in the Battle of Britain and they carried prestige. And I do think certain squadrons, one of the other things, you know, this whole Rhubarb operations list is dying to be compiled, because you could see then how many squadrons did it. And the spreadsheet that I've got on Rhubarb losses, one of the things I hope to do is sort it by squadron to see what squadrons had the most losses, and then go back through the ORBs and see then what their attitudes is to ORBs, and I'm sure to Rhubarbs, and I'm sure it coincides that the worst losses you got, the worse you think it was a waste of time.
Do you know what the experience of the foreign pilots who took part in these raids?
No, that's again something that I think would be a really interesting angle to have a look at. For example, I know 3 Polish pilots were reprimanded for just apparently doing indiscriminate attacks, but whether that was because they were Polish pilots and the Air Ministry's thought, oh, you know, they're going around shooting everything up, but obviously English pilots wouldn't do that sort of thing. You know, so there's an interesting thing to go on there and to explore as well. But yeah, I think the whole thing about the communication issues between you go over there, you attack this, if you don't attack this, you come back, you don't shoot anything else up. I'd be interested to see if that actually ever worked in real life, and I don't think, looking at the stuff I've seen so far, it did.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a question here from Simon Thompson. Hello, Simon. He says, were rhubarbs the air equivalent of deer, in the sense that there had to be they had to be seen to be doing something?
Yeah, I think there might be something to do with it. There's certainly an issue about, well, if the RAF doesn't do something, what do we do? It's like, you know, the Royal Air Force are the only people who can take the offensive to Germany. You obviously got Bomber Command doing the same thing. Fighter Command are going, well, what can we do? And rhubarbs, if you look at it on paper, seem like an obvious thing to do. You go over to enemy territory. The whole issue about attacking enemy aircraft, even looking at statistics, never actually worked. You very rarely see enemy aircraft. But the ground targets possibly did work. And also, you know, as hinted in one of the things, you got the Fighter Command got press coverage out of it as well. So that, you know, they were being active.
This is serendipitous, Gary, because the next question is, how important were these operations in British propaganda?
I would imagine they were very important because it showed that the pilots were still doing things. You still had the British public was still very much in awe of the RAF because of the Battle of Britain. Their great heroes were literally taking the fight to the enemy in very dangerous circumstances. To investigate the propaganda around rhubarbs, I think would be a very intriguing thing to do, and to look at how it was depicted in the press and how much censorship there was going on at the time. Obviously, by the time of the freight train incident, not a lot, because apparently it made the radio news. I did do a newspaper search, interestingly, and never found that article, so that's something to look for.
Okay, great. Do we have any more questions in the room? Don't be shy. Opportunity to really torment Gary. Okay. So let's see if there's another juicy online question. The question of whether or not the Germans operate in a similar sense has attracted some discussion online, which is very pleasing to see. What's your sense of the German, both their response to rhubarbs themselves and how they chose to operate against Britain during this period?
Yeah, I mean, there was, people say that there was some fighters coming over here to shoot things up just after the Battle of Britain, because people assume the Battle of Britain started and finished on these dates, and German fighter aircraft never come over here again. Well, we all know that didn't happen, but so that's quite an interesting concept. In terms of how it was all... Sorry, what was the first part of the question, Harry?
How did the Luftwaffe set out to respond to these?
Yeah, that is... You can see that the raised flak defences happened, so that must have been a part of the rhubarb operations. Yeah, the fact that no enemy aircraft were very rarely found, that must have been a Luftwaffe operation as well. But what I think would be a good piece of research would be go and have a look to see how the Luftwaffe did this. Because I think, in many ways, ironically, the RAF would have rhubarbs, and in many ways copying what the Luftwaffe were doing in 1940 when they were trying to take out RAF airfields. So it's quite an interesting thing. And the fighters were still coming over here to shoot things up on occasion.
I suppose it raises the question of how do we consider rhubarbs to be successful?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
And does that change during the course of the war? I mean, by the time they're attacking crossbow sides,
Yeah.
a very different measure of success,
Yeah.
presumably, to the early raids.
Yeah, it's interesting because that, I think, is one of the reasons have not really been covered, because it's like there's a sense among historians, you know, from the research that I've done, these were just pilots getting in aircraft, flying over to occupied territory, shooting something up and coming back. That's literally what you can see. They're called freelance intrusions, or they're this, they're that. And that's certainly not the case. So the whole idea of how do you measure success on rhubarbs, I mean, you've got fighter command center out. I don't think they're very successful, but then in the next note going, well, actually, they were a bit more successful than I thought. So there was all that going on. And the whole thing, what I think is intriguing is, as a gentleman mentioned earlier, the whole experience that the pilots would have gained was that could you then look at that for like noble operations and say the pilots that took part in Rhubarbs were then very successful during noble. So that's a big, massive piece of research to do, which I think would be quite interesting. But overall, I just think the Rhubarbs are sort of literally under the ground, no pun intended, from anything else that's there. No, people haven't looked at them yet in terms of success because they just get swamped with everything else. People think, oh, you know, certain pilots were killed on Rhubarbs, they weren't a success, let's move on and talk about something else.
Do you find it strange that the RAF didn't keep to a very fixed definition of what Rhubarbs
Yeah.
were? And
Yeah.
do you think, in a way, that says that they weren't successful initially?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out why they were called Rhubarbs. I still haven't found that information out, and I've been looking everywhere you can think of. I mean, obviously there was an R thing going on with radios, ramrods, etc. So there was that. And I think, you know, even in the evidence that I've shown, the RAF command were getting themselves in a confusion about what different operations were designated, etc. Because you've got Rhubarbs, then you've got long-range Rhubarbs, which is with the fuel tanks, and then on top of that, you've got Rhubarb designated nobles. So that's 3 different things already. So yeah, I think the fact that they couldn't work it out, couldn't work out the designation, very much right from the beginning is worry about what the RAF are going over there and shooting up, what the German propaganda are going to make of it, you know, all this thing. There's loads of confusion over it, and it's intriguing that what I think is intriguing is something I've spoken to Harry about, is that these were still going on in 1944. If these were not successful, if they were not shown to hit the targets or cause something, why were they being flown in Burma, for instance? You know, it's an intriguing thing to look at. They must have been doing something for the Royal Air Force to carry on using that tactic.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any questions here? Yes.
Yeah, well, you asked if you think there's sort of a training aspect to Rhubarbs and pilots. That could possibly be a very good point, actually, because I think that the whole point of going over, there was a rumour going around that only certain types of pilots volunteered to do Rhubarbs, you know, slightly mad pilots from some of the stuff I've seen. But from what I've actually looked at, you had to be very disciplined, you had to be incredibly brave, obviously, to do that. And I agree that there would have been some sort of training aspect going on. I'd be interested to see if experienced pilots went with slightly less experience, because it usually, even though they said a flight, which was 6, I've only really come across like maybe 2 going over at the same time. So that would be an interesting thing to look at. So yeah, I think that, and I think when it then later come to ground, you know, after the invasion of Europe, for instance, you've got these pilots that are now experienced in hitting ground targets that arguably they wouldn't have been without Rhubarb operations. So that's an interesting point. Thank you.
Okay, now we've got a question which I'm going to ask because I know that you, as a professional wrestling fan, will love it. Okay, because we all agree on who the GOAT is, the greatest of all time, and it's a question about Operation Jericho. So you know why I'm asking you this question.
Go on then. I thought it was The Rock. I was going to do the eyebrow, but never mind.
No, I will resist making any more puns. The Army's jail raid, Simon asked, could it be described as a super Rhubarb in a way? You know, they look to break the walls down with these long-range operations, the clear ground attack mission. Do you feel, and I guess this drives into how do you define these operations?
Exactly.
What makes them stand out from other sort of specific missions such as Operation Jericho?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's a really good point. I'm sure that the Rhubarbs sort of, other people see what was happening and what was going on, and then other departments, the Army, for instance, would have taken that up and gone, oh, okay, this is what we do. We go forward, we target this, we intrude. I think the best thing, I think it's a shame that they stopped using the code word mosquito, because I think Mosquito really summed them up a lot better than Rhubarbs, because Mosquito is just basically going over and being really annoying. And I think that was the thing, and also strategically hitting certain targets. And I think even the target designation on Rhubarbs causes confusion at times. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, that it was when the Rhubarbs were doing this, other places would be seeing the offensive, and it would have been helping. I'm sure there's records somewhere where there is in the TNA file, thinking about it, there's definitely Army Air Force cooperation documents relating to Rhubarbs, which I haven't looked at and looked through yet, but definitely they would have been, we're doing this, assist us by hitting this, this and this. Even maybe they'd be even using them as diversionary tactics.
Okay, now we've got a question from G, which I'm going to break into two parts. Which the first part is that you said that not many famous pilots were killed on Rhubarb missions. It's sort of a misconception. They mentioned that Paddy Finnegan is, of course, one of the most famous. Lockie, of course, prominent individual. So I suppose the question is, are they just seized upon, that they catch the limelight, but it's not more common? Are they really exceptional in that sense, or?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was over the 200 pilots killed, but I think the ones that have got this phenomenal record, incredible bravery, and sort of got this aura around them, such as Finnegan, such as Locke, example, that is why the publicity catches more, and I think that in itself has gone on to lead to Rhubarbs being sort of dismissed in the past. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's fair. Okay, so the next part of this is around the name Rhubarb.
Mm.
They've suggested a reason which I happen to love. They say that, is it perhaps because, unlike mushroom raids, which were in the dark, they were kept in the light. And they add, I have to read this out, because unlike on mushroom missions, they were kept in the light when the manure was thrown on them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can see that, yeah. I can see the daylight aspect of that, definitely, yeah.
I love that. Okay. Do we have any more questions in the room before? Yeah, yes, go on.
I think I understood you right in saying that Rhubarb operations were usually undertaken under cloud cover conditions.
Mm.
Do you think that was kind of consistent with the concept of wanting to engage enemy fighters?
Yeah, that Gordon just asked whether it's sensible to have RAF pilots undertaking Rhubarbs under cloud conditions, which is actually part of the Rhubarb designation, but also being able to attack enemy aircraft at the same time. I completely agree, it just doesn't make sense, and that probably is one of the reasons why enemy aircraft are hardly ever sighted. If you look at the statistics, it's very rare for somebody on a Rhubarb to engage enemy aircraft. They very much become a ground operation, but Sholto Douglas would not admit that. He was still talking about, they're all about attacking enemy aircraft in the air, because I'm guessing this is from after the Battle of Britain, it's all this thing about we shoot down more air fighters than they do, Maybe that again goes back to, being a propaganda thing, etc. as well. But yeah, it was like they flew in the most atrocious conditions you could get. They hardly ever see any aircraft. They would shoot up ground targets and come back. The fact that they were flying in atrocious weather over in occupied Europe would normally mean that the Luftwaffe wouldn't be flying then as well. So it just doesn't make sense.
Okay, right. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
They worked out when
Mm.
why shoot down the plane?
Yeah.
You can shoot down the pilot. They're not getting the plane.
Yeah. You mentioned about the RAF sort of targeting the personnel rather than the aircraft. And yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a strategic shift at some point where somebody says, well, we can't hit that, we'll hit the personnel. And in the two examples that I showed you, there's evidence of them shooting up Germans in a field or shooting Germans who are on a road, that sort of thing. And, if you can't hit the aircraft, hit the ground crew. They're less replaceable than an aircraft is. So, in terms of resources, etc. So that, I think at some point, that's when they decided to shift over and do that. Because in terms of, even with the radar files in the archive, there's a bit about, you know, where the personnel are for that as well. So they are seen at that point as if they're military and are involved in attacking, they are a legitimate target. Yeah, oh yeah, certainly. I mean, you mentioned about if you bail out, you can actually survive it. Yeah, certainly. I mean, there was a lot of occasions in the Battle of Britain where a race would get shot down, bail out and come back again. You know, that doesn't do it. To be quite harsh, you need to kill the person, not the aircraft. It's that simple.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Sally McGlone, who I think we all know. Hello, Sally. Were the Halifax missions flown by 3 French squadrons, Rhubarbs? And if they were not, did they follow a similar process?
Oh, good question. That is something I need to look into, because I would imagine that they were all coming under Rhubarb operations, but again, that's something I'd need to investigate and look at.
Artfully dodged. Okay.
Thank you.
So Matt asks, given the unsuitability of the Spitfire for these operations, do the responses of squadrons flying different types shed any light on the opinion of the operations?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that depending on what aircraft you had and its reliability at its maximum range would have certainly influenced your opinion on whether the Rhubarbs were operational or not. You know, things like the Hurricane, as you mentioned, the long-range tanks, certainly help the fact that you're going over there, you're looking for a target, you're not under as much time pressure as if you're flying the Spitfire at its very, very limit of its range. And of course, one thing I didn't mention is that later on, more armaments were added so that they were actually more ground attack aircraft in some instances.
Okay. Do we have any more questions in the room? No? Okay, I'm gonna ask you this, Gary, which was something I put to you before your talk, which was, I think it ties into the question we've had about training and whether or not, in a way, that keeping these pilots active had a benefit in and of itself. But what were the alternatives to flying Rhubarbs?
Yeah.
Particularly in the strategic sense. Where might these resources have been directed otherwise? And does that, in a way, answer the question as to whether or not this was the right operation for the RAF to be taking part in 1941?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, the obvious thing to look at is the fall of Singapore, really, and the Far East, and whether the RAF resources could have been shipped over there and helped there. The problem is that's hindsight, which is a great thing, because at the time Singapore was thought to be impregnable. Nobody was going to take it, so they couldn't do it. Also, I think, as was alluded to earlier, Fighter Command were trying to work out how to use their experience and how to, propaganda possibly as well, how to make an impact if Bomber Command was making an impact, how they could make an impact as well at the time. And I think Rhubarbs were the thing when I thought, okay, this is what we're going to do. And what's intriguing is that on the very, very first draft of Rhubarb, which I've come across in the files, it is specifically attacking enemy aircraft. That seems to be the core of it. And it sort of evolves into ground attack. So I think that, yeah, you could arguably say, yeah, why were they not putting all these men and resources and experienced men into places like theatres such as the Far East? But at the time, they thought, oh, okay, we're not needed there, they're fine. We cannot attack. And another thing was they wanted to make the occupying forces think about what they were doing, which I think is a thing. You know, they wanted to make them not have free rein, you know, and, you know, as mentioned about the Free French forces, they wanted to make sure that occupied Europe knew that the RAF was there and was going to assist them in their freedom if they could.
I think I almost want to turn that question on its head now and say, is it the fact that the RAF separated out into these individual commands and that Douglas knows that if his command isn't active, he's going to lose his resources?
Yeah.
How important is that in shaping his decisions to undertake these
I think that resource management, I think in some ways is at the core of Rhubarb operations. I think with Sholto Douglas, all the way through everything, he's saying about attack enemy aircraft, we're the Royal Air Force, we're Fighter Command. That's what we do. We don't do ground targets, we attack enemy aircraft. But you can see the reality was completely different. And I think if he'd have just sat back and said, no, we're not going to do anything, Bomber Command can take the offence to Germany, deeper into Germany as well. we can just defend Britain. He was probably worried about his resources, worried about losing his resources, and also worried about the effect it would have on his men. You know, this Rhubarbs were keeping pilots and fighter pilots active and experienced in combat.
Okay. Do you have any more questions? No, you don't need to be shy.
Yes, you do.
Okay, see if there's another one online. I don't want to bogart the whole conversation, Gary, much though I might like to. So we've got a question here from Professor Kuhner. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, which is, wouldn't rhubarb circuses, rodeos, and the other types of operations meant to tie down more Luftwaffe units, especially after weren't they supposed to tie down more Luftwaffe units, especially after 1942 in France?
Yeah.
And if so, were they successful?
Yeah, I mean, that's a part. I mean, we know things that sweeps, circuses, rodeos, rhubarbs, etc., were all involved in trying to do that. Again, it was taking the offence to the enemy. I believe they had an influence. I need to prove that, obviously, rather than disbelieve it. But I believe that they definitely had an influence in altering Luftwaffe's tactics, just by the amount that were going on at the time and what they were doing.
Do we have a sense of how many fighter squadrons were moved into Western Europe during this time, similarly for light flak?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, well, yeah, at the very early stages of Rhubarbs, there was nothing happening. It was all being flown by Britain. But later on, even when in occupied Europe, in France, for instance, they were flying Rhubarbs from there, and they're flying other fighter sweeps from there as well.
Okay, I think that'd be interesting to see the number of German light flak units which get moved into
exactly. And whether the Luftwaffe were coming into, you know, if more squadrons were coming in to counter Rhubarb operations and, you know, looking at that. And that's possibly why at first you look at the radar file and it specifically says these targets are not open for attack yet. So that's quite intriguing. It's the only file that's got that on it. So whether that's to do with flak or to do with the Luftwaffe being seen to move into that area, don't know.
Yeah. Do you speak German, Gary?
No, I don't, but I need to.
You're going to have to get into those German files.
Yeah, exactly. I need to. I need to go to Berlin for some reason. I just need to.
We all need to go abroad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for one last online question before we wrap. And the question it's from G again. Wouldn't the use of Rhubarbs have also assisted Bomber Command at night in the anti-aircraft crews and German fighter stations would have had to have been on 24/7 alert?
Yeah, exactly.
And couldn't be diverted to other fronts, and we sort of touched on that as well.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I think that the whole sort of attrition aspect of Rhubarbs is underplayed. And yeah, if you've got the worry of fighter command coming over during the day, and then you've got bomber command coming over during the night, it is literally going to wear down. And of course, also Rhubarbs could ID where flak was for the bomber command coming in later in. So yeah, so there's lots of two-way communication going on.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm going to quickly wrap up before we say thank you to you by saying to our online audience, this won't mean nothing to anyone in the room. Thank you very much for being patient as we sorted out some of the issues of sound. I want to say a big thank you to Stephen, who's in the back and has been diligently sorting through these problems. It's the first time we've done the live streaming from the lecture theatre in this way. So it has been a learning experience. Some of the comments which have been made, we have anticipated and they're planned for in the future. But I think I said to Stephen, what this really shows is how amazing a job I've been doing for the past year. So I really want to take a moment to reflect on what a great job I've been doing. I'm really pleased. But we do have another online lecture coming up where it is in the evening. It will just be from my laptop. So none of these small issues. So I hope people join us. It's all on our Crowdcast channel. We'll have another one of these lunchtime lectures in July, where we'll be looking at the Battle of Barking Creek with Nick Black. And the best experience, as I'm sure our audience here will attest to, is in person, in the flesh.
Yep.
We'll have mics roaming through the audience then as well, hopefully. But I do also want to point people towards our conference, which is going to be both in person and online. You can find details on our website. I'm going to post them into the chat as well. But really, Gary, I want to say thank you very much. It's been fantastic having you relaunch our lunchtime lectures and for being so patient with all these questions, because we've tormented you with so many great questions. So thank you very much. And if everyone can just say thank you to Gary.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, this perilous moment as Steve cuts the stream.
Oh, yeah. Hmm? Oh, thanks. Was it all right? It's like, oh. Sounds like nobody actually heard me online, but never mind. So. Yeah, oh, God, yeah. Oh. I can go and get lunch now and fall down. Yeah.
Most of the people know that, but then the other officers, it's still pretty much empty. So.